Sometimes, there's nothing you can do. Firewatch begins with you at the mercy of text boxes. You are Henry, a drunken everyman who has just fallen head over heels for an Australian scholar you spotted across a bar in Colorado. No matter how charming or crude you are, this girl decides to buy you a cheeseburger. Her name is Julia. From here, Firewatch relays a story of romance that quickly evolves into a story of marriage and developing a lifelong relationship, all to slowly deteriorate into one about heartbreak. Julia has dementia. Control is something that is seen as the peak of human existence. A sense of agency over one's life is ideal for some. The ability to do what you want when you want is a powerful feeling, and is one that many may never get to experience. The circumstances of life have no bounds. It doesn't matter how in control you feel in one moment. The next can easily strip this away. Henry is trying to escape this fact. After sending his wife to live with her parents, he takes a job in the forests of Wyoming as a lookout for wildfires, trying to escape his reality and regain possession of his life, no matter how futile this attempt may be. In a matter of moments, Firewatch shows you what it's all about. Once the introduction ends and the game relinquishes control to the player, it gives them a sense of agency alongside it. The slow, toned-down game is one that presents you with choices, some of which are as insignificant as the motion to choose them. They're all choices nonetheless. But it also shows you that no matter what you do, what items you pick up, what route you take, what you say, sometimes there's nothing you can do. Upon arrival at the Shoshone National Park, the player discovers Henry's role this summer is going to be to spot fires, report them, and that's about it. It's an important job as fires left unchecked can ravage a forest in a matter of hours and an entire countryside in a matter of days. But usually, once a fire starts, it's too late to stop it. There are methods of prevention, like creeping out drunk teenagers who are setting off fireworks by throwing their stereo in the water, but for the most part, there's nothing you can do. The Flapjack Fire, or Big Fire, or June Fire, depending on how lonely you're feeling at this point in the story, appears on day 64. It's a destructive mass of flames, sure, but at least from your tower, it's beautiful. You know that from a different perspective, it's a tragedy. Entire ecosystems are being destroyed in seconds, animals are losing their homes, the beauty of the forest won't return for, at the very least, the rest of the season. However, all Henry can do is sit back and watch it unfold before his eyes, unaffected by its unstoppable nature. Delilah, your boss, calls it in, but says that there's not much that can be done other than suppression. Some controlled burn locations to the south show the effort firefighters put in to keep it contained, but like Dee says, you're stuck with it for the rest of the summer. At the moment, it's not really a big deal for Henry though. He's separated from the fire by the hills and the trees of the Shoshone. It's not his problem, at least it isn't right now. Other than viewing its warm glow from the railing of his tower, he's disconnected from it. Julia has dementia. You learn this from the text introduction early in the game. It starts off slow, a few outbursts at work, forgetting small things, thinking her father is at the door while her and Henry are in bed together. But she only gets worse. As Julia slips further into her symptoms, Henry's control over her can go in multiple ways. You have a choice on how to care for her, but one option is no better than the other. You can keep her at home and try to maintain autonomy over your marriage, over her. Henry will lock her in their room with a chair on the handle. He'll stay up all night, both to have time to himself and to ensure Julia stays in bed. But Henry doesn't sleep. He drinks excessively. He drives impaired. He trauma dumps on a bartender in this situation. By trying to maintain or even increase his control over her, things only get worse for the two. Their house is in shambles when Julia's parents come to visit. It's clear Henry never had control over the situation. He just wanted to. Julia goes to stay with her parents from now on, and you don't object. On the other hand, you can send her to a facility where they can care for Julia properly. But in a way, by relinquishing control, Henry is still exerting his influence over Julia. It's never said if she opposes or if she's even in a state where she would be able to do so. This choice also takes a toll on Henry's mental health. By doing this, he's isolated, both from his friends who criticize him for abandoning Julia and from his wife, who is, in a way, no longer there. A loved one falling victim to a degenerative disease is taxing, to say the least. I'm not going to pretend to know how devastating watching someone you used to spend every day with fade into a stranger. But what I do understand is that spouses, both those giving care or relinquishing control of care to an outside entity, often feel like they're grieving the loss of somebody that is still, in a way, around. Caregiver fatigue is an incredibly real and underrepresented struggle, as it, somewhat rightfully, takes a back seat to the struggles of the person suffering from an illness. Many feel they're losing the autonomy of their own lives by having to care for their unwell partners, a duty they're obligated to, but one that will always be unpleasant and heartbreaking. When examining this game, the theme of escapism is brought up, the act of distracting oneself from the realities of life. By taking this job in Wyoming, Henry is actively running away from his problems. Even Delilah herself says that the people that take this job are usually trying to get away from something. Prior to even coming to the Shoshone, Henry slowly begins to separate himself from Julia, going from visiting her every day to every other day. I do believe there is a reading that is as simple as Henry took this job to distance himself from Julia, but I think that this can also exist alongside a perspective that reads as Henry took this lookout job as a way to rebuild control over his life. By leaving Boulder, Henry is making the decision to live a life free from the burden that comes with Julia. He knows he can't run away from his problems forever. He knows that once the summer ends, he's going to have to go back to his empty home and back to his mess of a life that had come crashing down. But if, even for a second, he could just sit in the driver's seat, freed from this weight on his shoulders, it was worth it. But he's not freed. Memories of Julia burden Henry all summer, and it's not like he wants to forget her. He's still wearing his wedding ring when he arrives at Two Forks. A picture of the two can be found on the desk. He even talks about her if you follow certain dialogue trees.
Henry, wake up. Get out of bed and pick up the radio.
Firewatch has many heartbreaking moments, but the one that touched me the most was on day 15. Delilah calls in the middle of the night for seemingly no reason. Henry begrudgingly picks up the radio and hears the voice of Julia. From here, the player can have their first interaction with her. But it doesn't matter. It's not real. It's a dream, an ideal version of the present. Henry didn't want any of this. He wanted Julia. He wanted to walk down by the river and drink beer while he watched his wife play with their dog. But there's no way to make this happen. Dementia doesn't come with an off switch. Sometimes there's nothing you can do. Henry doesn't want to get away from Julia. He just wants to get away from this Julia, the Julia that doesn't look him in the eyes, the Julia that thinks he's a stranger, but he knows that he can't. There's no way to outrun this reality. The only thing that he can do is ignore it for as long as he can. No matter where he goes, this problem looms over him. There is no escaping. Henry can lock his wife in their room, he can send her away from him, but it's always going to be there. And it's always going to be controlling the decisions he's making. That's why he's in Two Forks in the first place. Henry is not in control. He's not free from the burden of his reality. He's simply viewing it from the railing of his tower. The fire continues to burn all summer. On day 79, it has reached your corner of the Shoshone. After remaining a spectacle for 15 days, it's become a hazard for Henry and Delilah to remain in the woods. But it's not just because of the flapjack big June fire though. On day 1, upon his return to his tower, Henry is greeted with his typewriter on the ground and his space destroyed. It's described as a freak thing, a random act of violence, but from here things begin to get even weirder. Communication lines are cut, revealing conversations between Henry and Dee are transcribed and recorded. Research sites are set aflame, a fire that merges with the natural wildfire. This vandalism and all the following terror that is committed toward Henry and Delilah is done by Ned Goodwin, an unstable former lookout hiding out in the area. In an attempt to cover up a crime he may or may not have committed, Ned plays Henry like a puppet, sending him on a wild goose chase for 79 days, all to reveal the truth of the situation to him when it's too late to make a difference. Prior to this, however, Henry feels both in and out of control, finding new clues every day and piecing together a mystery while also feeling watched in every moment. He's made to believe he's being studied and manipulated by researchers, that he's in the Shoshone for a reason other than his own selfish desires to run away. And Henry doesn't have to piece together this mystery. It would be more beneficial for a ranger to come out and do it for him. He's actively putting himself in danger by looking into this, but he wants to do it because it's one of the only times as of recent he's felt that he can do what he wants. None of what he unearthed was true, of course. Everything Henry believes is fabricated by Ned. As the world around him burns, Henry is shown the truth, that it was all a big cover-up for something that didn't involve him in the slightest. He was simply a casualty in a cover-up for a crime that may or may not have happened. It didn't matter. None of it mattered. And in the shadow of his deception, the reality of his situation creeps back in. Henry has to leave all of this behind, the mystery that distracted him from his problems, the job that removed him from his situation, and the control that he finally had is all going to be taken away from him by this unstoppable force. The fire is edging closer every second. His problems finally caught up to him. He ran, he hid, he tried his best to find some way to be in control of his life once again, and it all fell flat. But even if he felt like it, Henry was never in control to begin with, whether it was the pain of his situation with Julia or the manipulation of a crazed man. He was always under the thumb of someone else. The fire creeps in. It used to be distant. It was a problem, sure, but one that Henry was removed from. It's always existed. It's only now that he has to face it. The air is smoggy and the world is painted shades of orange. Even if you wanted to stay, it would be futile. And from here, Henry is given another choice. He can face what has been tormenting him and return to Julia, or he can continue to run. But if he does choose to continue to run, what happens next? Henry clearly can't escape his reality forever. Eventually, it's going to creep back in. He might think that he's taking control by ignoring his responsibilities, but in reality, he's still letting them control his life, just from a distance. Nothing is going to change what happened with Julia. It doesn't matter how much distance Henry puts between them, both literally and metaphorically, that burden will always be with him. He can't change that, no matter how hard he tries. Sometimes, there's nothing you can do. Summer 1986, 3 years before Henry arrives in Two Forks. A new lookout arrives for the season, a middle-aged war veteran. His name is Ned Goodwin. Alongside him joins his son Brian. The summer with the two was relatively quiet. Ned wasn't the most talkative lookout according to Delilah. As a matter of fact, she didn't take much of a liking to Ned, or at least not in the same way she did with Brian. Since Ned was radio silent for most of the summer, Delilah was left with no other option for conversation other than Brian Goodwin. He was a good kid. He loved to draw, play with electronics, play a rip of Dungeons and Dragons called Wizards and Wyverns, and had a key interest in science of all types. While he wasn't her first choice, Brian served as a great companion to Delilah. But after a few weeks, the Goodwins disappeared. There was no explanation to why, they just up and left. In all honesty, it was likely for the best. Brian wasn't a huge fan of the wilderness and really wasn't supposed to be there anyways. It was against forest regulations. He was actually almost caught one night by pilots of a suppression plane, but Delilah assured them that the child they thought they saw was just another lookout. 3 years later, Brian is just a memory now, a kid who spent a few short weeks in Wyoming and moved on with his life. But he didn't. Brian is dead. It's revealed just like everything else in the game, unceremoniously. You stumble across his body at the bottom of a cave next to some broken climbing gear. Delilah is obviously devastated when you tell her. She blames herself. She should have told the truth. But Ned was not a good father. He pushed Brian too hard, encouraging him to do things he wasn't capable of without the assistance needed to achieve these near impossible tasks. It's the reason Brian ended up in the bottom of this cave in the first place. It's the reason Ned antagonized Henry for the whole summer, because he thought he was going to be caught and blamed for his child's death. Near Ned's makeshift bunker, Henry is presented a tape. On it, Ned reveals everything. He was the one tapping the radios. He faked the research study. He speaks on the death of his son. But he doesn't describe it as an accident. He doesn't admit guilt. He doesn't even express remorse, saying that the questions from the police and holding the funeral for his dead child were too much for him. Instead, he blames Brian.
You guys don't know anything about having kids. All right, nobody knows nothing. It ain't Andy and Opie walking down a lake to fish every afternoon. It ain't Mayberry. But you gotta know I didn't kill him. All right, we were climbing. I was teaching him. Brian was uneducated in the way to do anything. He just fucking didn't sink his anchor the right way.
But Ned did kill him. He brought Brian out somewhere he wasn't supposed to be. He pushed him to do something he wasn't ready for. He fundamentally failed him as a father. Brian might not have sunk his anchor the right way, but that was just the final nail in his coffin. Every other one was ingrained by Ned. However, Delilah doesn't see it this way. To her, Brian's blood is on her hands. If she had just told the truth, or at the very least came clean to her supervisors at some point that summer, instead of vouching for this kid that served as a temporary distraction from her problems, maybe someone could have come and taken Ned's place. Maybe someone could have come to take Brian. Maybe. Delilah was a bystander that didn't say anything, and for that, she shoulders the blame in her own mind. But Delilah isn't his parent. She didn't choose for him to be out here in the woods. She had no control over what Ned chose to do with his son. If they leave Two Forks, what happens next? Ned would continue to put Brian in risky situations. Who's to say this doesn't happen to another lookout in another park? In the end, it doesn't matter. Brian is still dead, no matter who's responsible. And responsibility doesn't have to belong to one person absolutely. Ned should have never brought Brian here in the first place. Delilah should have told the truth about there being a kid in Two Forks. Brian should have just sunk his damn anchor right. It was all just a perfect storm. No one thing caused Brian to die. There's no smoking gun. Just a series of unfortunate events that led to an avoidable tragedy that would be discovered at the bottom of a cave 3 summers later. However, maybe it's nobody's fault. Maybe the anchor was faulty. Maybe the rope wasn't compatible with it. Maybe Brian's hands were too sweaty and they caused him to slip. Maybe the erosion of the cave and the rock was just right on that particular day in 1986 that caused it to slip out. Maybe one of the adults in Brian's life could have saved him. Or maybe there was nothing they could do. Firewatch is not an adventure game. It's not an open-world thriller. It's more of a walking simulator that uses the Shoshone as a backdrop for its story. The majority of the gameplay is the dialogue between the player and Delilah. Instead of filling its runtime with moments that make you hold your breath and make your heart rate fly into the hundreds, Firewatch makes itself interesting by presenting you with choices. You get to choose which dog you and Julia get. You get to choose whether or not you damage private property of children. You choose how long you spend exploring the depths of the forest looking for interesting, albeit useless, lore. In the end though, it doesn't affect anything. None of it matters. Bucket dies in the intro and becomes nothing more than a memory and a talking point. Throwing the stereo into the lake doesn't change the fact that the girls will call you a creep, blame Henry for destroying their campsite, and go missing. They turn up in the end no matter what. The notes between Ron and Dave, while heartbreaking and incredibly well written, are shafted as nothing more than an Easter egg, with whether or not the player seeks out to complete the story completely up to their own discretion. Adding to this, the depths of the forest is a bit of a misleading term. The Shoshone portrays itself as seemingly endless, like you can walk through a group of trees and end up in a completely new area, unmarked on your map. And though it is easy to get lost, the forest isn't endless. It has very clear, defined boundaries where you can and cannot go. Firewatch gives the illusion of freedom, the belief that, given the chance, you can do whatever you want, but you are on a very set path from the moment Henry arrives in Two Forks. The only real control you have in this game is the dialogue. The player doesn't really do anything other than talk to Delilah, and they're allowed to approach these interactions in a few ways. The player can make Henry serious, funny, defensive, closed off. You can even avoid dialogue at times if you think it's the best option. You can approach the conversation in this game however you want, and there's a good chance that one person's dialogue would sound completely different than another's. Your only job as the player of this game is to sit back and watch the story unfold. Day 64, the night of the fire. It's the middle of the night. Henry is standing on the edge of his tower, looking out at the glowing mass in the distance with his radio in his hand. At this point in the game, Henry and Delilah's relationship has had time to develop, but this is the first time the two begin to get romantic. Personally, I was torn. Henry is married. Whether his wife has dementia or not, he has a commitment to his partner. I just let the dialogue timer run out, and Henry stayed silent towards Dee's advances. Day 79. Henry figures out who's been harassing them all summer, and Delilah doesn't really seem to care. Her mind is elsewhere. The fire is closing in, and with no reasonable escape on foot, helicopters are dispatched to airlift Henry and Delilah to safety. While I was still near Two Forks, one arrived at Thoroughfare Lookout, Delilah's tower. Reasonably, she says she's going to go with them, and I told her to wait. I don't really know why I did. There's nothing to be gained by having her wait there. It was just a snap decision. I guess even if the two didn't form a romantic relationship through the dialogue, they still formed a bond, and wanting to put a face to the voice that you've been listening to all summer was only natural. You can imagine my disappointment when I arrived at her lookout to find it empty. She had left. Henry sits at her desk and puts on the headset she used to talk to him, only to hear her voice. The conversation they have is rough. I asked her to come to Boulder. She said no, but I think the moment that stung the most was the last thing I chose to say and what she said back.
I'll see you when I see you.
Yeah, okay. Sounds good. Bye, Hank.
I thought it was because of me, because I hadn't chosen the right dialogue options, or I missed a special piece of lore that would unlock a new ending where the connection that these two formed wasn't all for nothing. I ran around her room looking for something, anything that could explain what I needed to do to fix this or somehow extend the game. But there was nothing I could do. Henry got on the helicopter and the game ended. I sat in my chair for a minute, half listening to Etta James' I'd Rather Go Blind as the credits rolled by and half stewing in my own disappointment. I let the game sit with me for about a day before I decided I couldn't let it end like that. There must be something I can do to make this right. So I turned on my PlayStation and opened a new save, determined that this time was going to be right. I was going to choose all the right things to get Henry and Delilah in that same room. I thought the night with the fire was crucial, so I chose all the dialogue options I didn't choose in the previous save. I avoided talking about Julia and her illness, and it felt wrong, but I just wanted the good ending. You can imagine my disappointment when I got to Thoroughfare to find it empty again. Henry sits at her desk and puts on the headset she used to talk to him all summer, only to hear her voice again. And the conversation they have is still rough. I ask her to come to Boulder and she still says no. But this conversation was still even marginally better, but for me, nothing changed. The ending was, all things considered, the same. It's because Firewatch only has one ending, disappointing as it may be. And that's when I realized, that's the point. It doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter if you accept Delilah's advances. It doesn't matter if you try to name the fire after her. It doesn't matter what you describe yourself as. It doesn't matter if you avoid talking about Julia. It doesn't change anything. Henry will always end up alone in her tower. Delilah will never accept your offer to come to Colorado, and Henry will always get on that helicopter and go back to his old, messy life. For almost 10 hours of my life, Firewatch pretended to give me the reins. It's a game that allows you to shape your interactions in whatever way you want, all to strip away that power when you think it will matter the most. And it's perfect. Like in reality, you don't control anyone in Firewatch other than yourself. You can tell Delilah to wait, you can want the relationship between the two to work, you can try everything in your power to get the ending you want so badly. But sometimes, there's nothing you can do.
I'm headed off to old Shoshone, where the birds and the bees won't know me. Man and war won't exist no more, and there ain't no gals to keep no score. I'm taking off for the woods, to a place where there ain't no shirts. Don't need no books or ponds or the ponderosas. Don't need no lady or Mary the Mariposa.